Well, I hope you all had a pleasant lunch and certainly an exciting conversation. We are the first panel after this, which means that we have been required to come up with many jokes to try to keep everyone awake, but no, not at all. So this panel will focus on how to use data in the context of preventing, forecasting, and impacting violence. And we have a fairly wonderful panel here, and I will simply read from this. Rayid Ghani, who is Director at University of Chicago Center for Data Science and Public Policy. Thank you for being here. Robert Muggah, who is with the Igarapá Institute, and I'm assuming that is Security and Development Specialist. There we go. And finally, Adrian. Adrian Gardner is the CIO, the Chief Information Officer of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Very, very much thrilled and honored to have you taking time from your respective busy schedules. My name is Michel, Leonard. We have two Canadians here, for once, and probably two Americans as well. And I am the Chief Data Scientist and Economist for the PeaceTech Lab. The context for this conversation is to look at the exciting use of data in order to model, forecast, understand violence. But not just in the context of forecasting, but in the context of impacting. And what's the difference between this? You know, I'm an economist by training. You've all seen economists doing forecasts. A forecast is simply telling you that there is something that may happen. What we're trying to do here at PeaceTech Lab is to look at a forecast but then say, how can we use this forecast to impact the future or impact developments? And think of it in the context of Amazon.com. Amazon, you go there, you buy something, and it will say, those who bought this will buy that. That's a forecast. The difference is that that kind of forecast influences you to actually buy something. So it impacts. So the kind of forecast and modeling that we're trying to do is a very practical one, and it's one that's aimed at equipping people from transforming and bringing the tech in peace. So that's just my little part here. And I'm going to start with a fairly straightforward question, and it is, in your respective experiences, what has been the main challenge to identifying, or just to, structuring the idea of data in the context of violence?
I guess I'll begin. My name is Adrian Gardner, as was mentioned. I am the Chief Information Officer for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I had the pleasure and privilege of establishing a capability called data.gov. I don't know how many of you are aware of that. I was the data architect for that capability. So it's when the government took its first shot at actually open data, making data available to folks so they could use it. As my administrator at FEMA would say, free the blank data. It's extremely important. It's an important endeavor for this administration. But as we start talking about this whole notion of now, how do we tie data to violence and also sort of, I would even say crime, if you will, FEMA is in the center of that in such a way, from a disaster standpoint. What we reflect back to is Katrina. And as we started our response activities, the media came along with us, and then they started to, I would say, criminalize actually survivors that were actually dealing with physiological and safety needs, right? But what you saw on the camera was them breaking into windows, actually trying to just survive. So as we look at this whole issue of data and the perception of it, one of the things that we've done is we've begun to create a capability called Open FEMA, where we now publish 31 data sets and 11 APIs around our data. So for example, you have capabilities like Trulia that actually have taken our data and now mashed it up with their residential data. Trulia as an online sort of residential application. And now what you can see when you go into that residence is you can look at the various hazards that actually accompany that particular community. But this whole issue of how do we now use data smarter, I think, is at the forefront of this discussion. And the government we are novices at that. Several of you are probably well ahead of us. But what the thing that we would ask is, can you help us? So as we put our data out there, we also have a data visualization tool that speaks to the amount of grants that are actually issued in response to a disaster. And we have a data viz tool out there, which I was hoping to share here, but I will get you the web links and all that afterwards. But our goal is that you will help us clean the data, make the data more relevant, and use it actually to ensure that together we work towards actually eliminating as much crime and sort of loss of, I would say, lawlessness as possible.
So my name is Rayid Ghani. I'm at University of Chicago, and I'm sort of an outsider here because I don't know much about conflict and violence other than you know, what we sort of a general person knows about. But I used to be a computer scientist, and then I decided I'm being fairly useless as a computer scientist because most of us are really, you know, working on things like telling you what ads to click on and telling you on Amazon you should buy this, whether you need it or not. And so what I've been looking at is sort of how can people like us help in important problems, right? And a lot of you are solving important problems, are dealing with important problems. So how can data and technology help? And what we've been doing at the University of Chicago over the past sort of 3-ish years is putting computer scientists, statisticians, social scientists, and public policy people together to solve problems that could use data. Because historically what's been happening is when an important problem comes along, somebody goes to an economist. And you know, economists are wonderful and
careful,
nice people.
Careful.
But they don't know how to use computers, right? So you have to kind of bring in, and so you can go to a computer scientist who know how to use computers but don't know how to solve a problem. So you have these sort of different communities sitting around, and what really needs to happen is bringing them together to solve problems that people care about, that have an impact, but solve them in a way that's scalable, repeatable, and can have real impact, right? So on the violence side, you know, there's going to be a lot of hype around data everywhere, where we can predict conflicts very accurately, very early, and very confidently. And most of it is going to be hype, because a lot of these things are, you know, when you say something is 90% predictable, that's hiding a lot of the subtleties underneath, right? I can predict 90% of the conflicts in the world if I predict there's going to be a conflict every day, everywhere, right? So I'll catch all of them, but I'll be just predicting conflicts all day long, right? So it turns out that it's important to build the technology to do these things, but it's also important to figure out what classes of problems can be solved with data. When is data useful? When is it not useful? When should you abstain from making a prediction? And some of the things we've been doing around it is a lot of the work that our group is involved in. One of the recent things around violence has been working in the US with police departments around everything that you hear in the media around sort of looking at, you know, police-community relationships, adverse interactions that the police has with community. And it turns out that, you know, government has been pretty far behind in this place. Police departments use these systems they call early intervention systems that are neither early nor they lend themselves to interventions that are other than firing somebody and punitive. So what we've been doing is looking at getting data from police departments, working with them to get their data and help them predict which officers are likely to have one of these interactions in the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then use different interventions, training, counseling things to try to prevent that. So as you know, we're talking about, prediction is just one piece. It's the beginning, but then you have to intervene. Otherwise, you can predict and watch things happen. And ideally, you want to predict and change the outcome. So.
Thank you. Robert?
Great. So I'm Robert Muggah. I'm also Canadian and an economist, so I've been slighted already. But as a Canadian, I can say we're back, right? And being back, I also want to acknowledge that we're on a man panel here. And I would say that maybe in our defense, some of us will be on panels with women later, but I also work with many women in my office, and I'm speaking on behalf of those women who are behind a lot of the work that I'm involved in. I have spent the last 20 years or so working on issues of violence in war zones and in centers of organized crime. I'm based in Brazil, running a think tank there, and have a couple of other think tanks I'm affiliated with. And Brazil is the world capital of homicide. There are more people who died in Brazil last year than in all of Syria. In fact, than in virtually every single conflict combined in terms of direct deaths. there were 60,000 homicides last year and hundreds of thousands more injured. So it's an issue that's very close to me personally and professionally, and it's one where I think, where we've essentially cut our teeth. But I started this business of looking at violence and trying to gather data and structure data and violence about 15, 20 years ago, doing verbal autopsy surveys with public health folks, epidemiologists. It wasn't high-tech stuff. It was simple probabilistic surveying in conflict zones to get a sense of how many people died in the wake of a conflict. And that's the basic granular way that we gather information. I then started working with people who were involved in doing what's called incident counting. So they would tabulate on the basis of media reports and vital registration data and human rights reports some kind of count around the number of people who died, which is an imperfect way of doing it. I then started working with people who did multiple estimation techniques, which is really a Bayesian statistical method of capture-recapture, looking at multiple casualties across different data sets to be able to estimate the death tolls in war zones. And then started working on homicide in countries that are effectively experiencing homicide rates that are equivalent to war zones and using a combination of public health and crime data. And so across all of those, I guess, disciplines and sectors, I realized each one of them was imperfect, that we need to start thinking about creative ways of bridging our knowledge, understanding in the public health fields, the criminological fields, and in the computer science fields, and even the economists got involved as well. And so a couple of years ago, we were approached, our think tank, by Google Ideas, to bring together, and it was a little along the lines of what you said, computer scientists, engineers, and frankly product developers to talk with social scientists and to see if we could bring the world of the gray, which is I call the social science world, together with the world of the binary with the computer science. And the early conversations were a little bit complicated, but after a while we started to think about ways of visualizing data in creative new ways. And I should emphasize that this discussion about violence data, it's not just difficult getting the data, whether you're doing surveys or incident counting or other methods. It's also a hugely taboo subject. And you don't have to go as far as Syria to realize the number of counts and estimates around the war dead. But the same applies to places like Brazil or Honduras or El Salvador or Kenya or South Africa, where the discussion around homicide and violence is one that's hypersensitive, hyper-political, and requires a huge amount of caution when it comes to validating the data. So I just want to simply say that behind us is one example of a data visualization which takes all of the world's homicide data at the national, subnational, and city scale, reproduced from sources like the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, but also from public health and crime police departments around the world, puts it on and allows you to get a spatial, temporal, demographic distribution of homicide rates over the last 10 years. It's not perfect. There are gaps. What you see right now is a live sort of a stream between the 10 top most homicidal countries in the world. But as a user, and you can all go online and get it, you can zoom in, zoom out, you can check out different data points around the world. And it was an effort to try to stimulate a debate in Latin America primarily, which is a hot spot when it comes to crime and violence, but also globally, around the issue of homicide data, the fact that not every country is equally affected, the fact that countries and cities can exit homicide. So it was a way of taking what is ultimately unstructured and quite disparate data, integrated into a simple platform to allow a range of users, from policy types to lay people, to have that conversation that's been taboo for so long. So I guess I'm a big believer increasingly in using these kinds of tools. They're not just bells and whistles. They can be used, I think, for very important policy reasons and ways of stimulating debate.
Thank you very much. That was the easy question, which was basically allowing the audience to know you a bit. My next question is a statement, and I'd like each one of you to react to it. When we've launched something called the Open Situation Room, the OSIX. We want this to be a learning and exchange platform, and the goal is to bring data and to bring models and different tools to empower folks in the peace-building community to bring the tech into PeaceTech. When going around and presenting this, quite often we're told, in the words of Sheldon, that there's a data blizzard out there. And it's interesting because we've had a conversation early on in that, yes, there's a lot of data, but at the same time, there's very little smart data, there's very little usable data, and to a certain extent, it almost makes it harder to find the data because there is this assumption that there is already enough. So if one were to say, you know what, at the end of the day, there isn't the right data, how does that relate to you? Do you feel you have the data you need, and if not, where would you go to find it?
I mean, I would react in this way. I mean, I agree, we have mountains of data, and within the government, we haven't managed it. And that's been long. That's been a long. In other words, if I went to look for metadata, metadata tagging for the data that would allow me to then draw some assumptions, mash up the data. There is no. We have not done that well as a government. Okay, but I guess I get more concerned about sort of the quantifiers or qualitative sort of metrics that we put around structured data versus semi-structured versus unstructured. Where FEMA is going right now, if we look at it,
would you mind just explaining that, the difference for the non-data scientist and the non-economist?
And I'm not a data scientist, so if I get this wrong, you guys can correct me. So structured data really is really structured, cleaned. It has a high level of confidence. You may have a metadata sort of format that you actually apply to all of the data, and it's pretty much you can read it, do it. People are handling it well. Semi-structured. Part of the data may have some sort of artifacts or metadata characteristics that you have, but it's actually not all there. It's not all clean, and you don't have high confidence in it. Unstructured, and these are just my words. I'm trying to break it down as layman. I may be wrong, but then unstructured is really think of your social media. How much confidence do I have that somebody says this gas station is open in the middle of New York? And people are flooding to it, and they get there, and then they find out actually it's not open, and gas is actually at a highly regarded, highly needed resource at that particular time because we're responding to the disaster. So one of the things that we're finding is that we have to look across the spectrum of the data to actually now get to the right answer. Because if you look at it from a structured data standpoint, obviously there takes a bit of time for you to now spit out the answer. And when we're talking about when people are losing their lives based on your inability to make a decision on the data, we also now have to take in the feeds of social media and also semi-structured data in order to get to the best answer we can get to at that particular time. So I think you have to look at the spectrum of time where you go from low confidence to high confidence. And if you're in a particular situation, you then have to make some kind of decision and how do you then communicate that up to decision makers? So I think the whole challenge that we see is that we have all of this data, we have all of this input. The other concern that I have is just from an operational standpoint is training our operators to rely on the data. Because at the end of the day, if I don't get them the data that then would drive them to a certain decision, they go with their gut. And their gut may be completely wrong. And it has catastrophic consequences. In other words, I may decide that because it's a 3-county flood, I actually evacuate a whole community, and actually I didn't need to really do that. And then I put people's lives in harm's way because I made that decision. But what we're trying to do now is really get the information, the data, into their hands in a way with a certain confidence level, saying, hey, it's about 70% confidence. We have a 70% confidence level that this is the right decision based on the data, and you got to go with that. But we're putting confidence levels around it. But I think you got to look at the mountain of data that we have, and I think at some point you got to just sort of begin to make sort of decisions based on what you have. And the other thing is, start to identify authoritative sources of data, right, where you can have more confidence in that data than others. So I think it's sort of, in my opinion, it's sort of trial and error right now. But that's what, in my opinion.
Thank you.
I mean, I think the amount of data. We've all seen estimates by pick your favorite McKinsey, Gardner, Forrester. Data is doubling every day, every 2 days, every 6 days, whatever number. And that's it's a little misleading because I can put a sensor in every centimeter in this room and it measures the temperature, the noise level, and the ambient light level, and that will generate a ton of data, probably more data than most government organizations generate in a year. Is that really how we define data? Because then we can pile up mountains and mountains and mountains. But I don't think that's the point. I think you have to think a little bit more carefully about what data means. Is what level of granularity do you have it on? Is it at the country level? Is it the state level, local level, individual level? How frequently is it collected? Is it once a second, once a month, once a day, once a year? And in some ways, if you combine those types of things, it turns out for most problems we're solving, at least in all policy areas, so education, health, energy, public safety, crime, development, we don't have a lot of data. We've got aggregated data. It's not collected very often. And we're trying to make decisions from it that it just doesn't support. Because you have to kind of match, the level of data you're collecting has to match the level of action. If an action is being taken on an individual, then you can't have aggregated data. If the level of action is real time, then you can't have a year-old data, right? So I don't think we have a lot of data. I think we have very little data. And the places where we have a lot of data, it generally tends to be biased, right? So the social media data, as you said, there's a lot of data there. A lot of it is redundant, which is good because you can almost use the redundancy to clean it up and figure out what's actually there and what's not there. At the same time, it's so biased that you start making the wrong inferences. And unless you're trained to deal with that data, you really don't know. And I think that's one big missing piece that right now is how people are used to doing really good surveys, and you weight them, pollsters aside, they don't know how to do anything. But in general, statisticians are trained to deal with that. Except when you move that into the social media world, you start making wrong inferences, partially because you don't know where that data came from. And we've all heard about the Sandy examples where most of the data coming wasn't even from the area affected by Sandy, and that's just one example. But I think we have to be careful about, there is a lot of data, it's probably not the right data, and it probably doesn't fit the problem you're trying to solve. So I think our challenge is to find these gaps. What should you collect? How often should you collect it? What level of detail should it be collected on? How should it be stored? How should it be managed? And I think the best way to do that is to motivate with use cases. Instead of telling people you should have this data, because who wants to collect data? Who wants to build an infrastructure? People get excited by the problems and the use cases. So I think that's where you need to motivate people by giving them, if you had 20 use cases, if you want to do these things, you have to collect this data. And I think that's what convinces people to go out and collect more data.
I'll be quick. So I think it really depends, just to summarize, I think what you both have been saying is it's also about data for whom and data for what, and at what level of granularity. And I would agree with you, ultimately, that I think we are in this information-saturated moment. We are competing, certainly as think tanks, maybe as government departments, for the attention, the ever scarcer attention of our policymakers. Having gripping, compelling, user-friendly data visualizations that policymakers can themselves engage with, I think, are one way of hopefully bridging some of those challenges in this information-saturated environment. But I would just simply underline what you said, which is that I think we have this false assumption, I think, because of the sheer volume of new data that's being generated, that somehow the data is actually, our quality of understanding is improving around the world. And I would argue that, in fact, when it comes to even some of the most basic metrics that we use to judge interventions, whether it's for development, humanitarian assistance, or peacekeeping, or peace building, we have a really superficial understanding of what's going on. At the state level, issues of poverty, measuring poverty, if you actually go in and look at the way that states measure basic metrics of poverty, gene inequality, youth unemployment, youth bulges, I mean, it's all based on predictive analytics, often based on sketchy weighting, often extrapolated from mere techniques of neighboring countries or neighboring neighborhoods. So I would argue that, in fact, the edifice of our knowledge and the confidence with which we make decisions is based on pretty sketchy information. Let me give you one very practical example. We're just building out a data visualization right now of cities around the world. We all know that we're entering the urban century. We just tipped the balance to 50%. We're going to have 75, 80% of future growth is going to be in Africa and South Asia. 3 countries, India, China, Nigeria, will account for about 40% of that growth. So we better get to grips with cities, right? Cities are really where a lot of the action is going to happen. If you believe McKinsey's, it's where 2/3 of global growth, 600 cities account for 2/3 of global growth. When we actually started to put together data on 2,137 cities over 250,000 people, what we discovered was that about 1,059 of them, you don't have anything. You have a geolocation coordinate, you have maybe a population estimate from the last census, maybe, and you got a name that's spelled 4 or 5 different ways depending on where you're looking. And so that tells us, I mean, this goes back to your bias point. So we know a heck of a lot, sort of, about what's happening in North America, parts of maybe Latin America and bits of Western Europe. We know virtually nothing what's happening in Africa outside of South Africa and a few cities in West Africa. We know a little bit of what's happening in India, and we know very little about what's happening in many of the fastest growing cities in parts of East Asia. And I would argue that tomorrow's fragility and instability mobility is not necessarily going to be in the northern world, I suspect. It's going to be in many of these fast-growing environments with cities that are growing at sort of hyperkinetic speed in large swaths of Africa, the Middle East, parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia. Of course, many of these other cities in North America and Western Europe are sort of shrinking in many cases, or at least stabilizing in size. So just to underline the point that I think, on some of the most critical issues of our time, for which we need to get really good analytical baseline data on which we can render maybe some predictive analytics, we have very limited understanding. So the last point I'll make is on the virtual world. I've been really fascinated recently by the whole idea of virtual violence, the way violence is going virtual, the way the gangs, for example, and drug cartels and others in my neighborhood are starting to use the net to sell product, to recruit people, to network, to sell guns. We're doing a lot of work looking at sort of Southern California and Northern Mexico. And I would just underline your point, which is that there's a huge level and a rapidly growing level of penetration of the net. There's an enormous amount of noise. And the idea that we can somehow extract some meta trend and analytics from all of that, I think, is really hopeful, to say the least. It's a lot about very painstaking digital forensics and putting together like old-style, qualitative-style research, overlapping sort of this new virtual domain. So I think it holds a lot of promise. I think that we're seeing massive penetration of the internet in many places where we need to get more information, but we have to be very careful what we can, I think, extrapolate from that and the policy conclusions that may flow from it. So just a caution.
Thank you very much. Before I open it for questions, first, it was great. I think it hits a lot of, hopefully, points that will make you all want to ask questions. But there are two words that I want to, or two issues I want to bring out. Training. I'll stress the importance of training, and that's part of what we want to do with the Open Situation Room. We want to make sure that we empower folks to have access to the data, but we also want to train the hands, because one of the things is that when you bring in a disruptive tool, you want to be able to find a way to work it within the institutional settings, the individual settings, the behavioral patterns, and so forth. There's something about data which I think sums this, the lack of data, not the right data. There seems to be, isn't there, this level of comfort in having these very specific numbers that tell us, we know what this is. Keynes, just to go back about the Economist, we have to come back that way. Keynes used to say a lot of people like to be precisely wrong rather than generally correct. It's a bit different. There's a little variation of that. But there is a lot of that. I mean, when we go and we present a nice equation, folks, no one questions us. It may be entirely wrong, but then we'll come with something else. So that's also important, the way we use the data. And I think as we're talking here about the complexity, some of what we need to do with some, for example, of the tools, again, we're bringing, is to make it accessible. So,
and transparent.
And transparent, accessible, transparent, and catered to specifically the needs of the users, not of data scientists and so forth. Okay, well, gentlemen, questions from the floor? So we have microphones going around. There's someone in the back with a microphone next to that person. Please go ahead.
So thank you all so much for addressing what I see as sort of this conflation between the rise in big data, transparency, analytics on the technology side, and actually a paucity of clean data. I'm just going to use the term clean data for myself. So I'm wondering if you can speak to this theme a little bit more broadly applied to not just peace, but also maybe social science research or even broader macro social problems. I work in the impact investing field, which obviously is a very nascent field looking for some kind of normalization. And there seems to be this belief in the sort of investment community, oh my gosh, social problems are totally measurable because there's cool analytics tools, like there's big consulting firms, McKinsey, et cetera, have this stuff all figured out.
By the way, they are not sponsors of this conference.
And really, a lot of times when I talk to early stage startups or I talk to funders, I really want to remind them this is on the art side of that. And the natural question is then, okay, what can the sort of ecosystem do? And so you all were having this really interesting conversation about that conflation. So I'm just wondering, technology is here, but it motivates questions around data capture and how that can be improved to get more granular on these kind of problems.
Thank you. Who would like to take that one?
I can do it. I mean, I think there's a lot of fascination with data, right? So I think DJ is not here, so but you're here, unfortunately. Okay. So I can say things about data.gov, right? So data.gov is a wonderful effort, but it's not there for the sake of the data. It's there for the sake of solving problems. And I think we do a really good job putting data out relatively. a horrible job telling people about the problems that data can solve. So if you take the tech community, you know, there's a hackathon every other weekend. What they do, they build maps. And maps of data that people who get the data already know what the map looks like. Right? Instead, if we told them, here are the 10 big problems in healthcare in the world. Here are 10 big problems in education. I think what happens is giving them those problems makes them use the data as opposed to just putting a map, because they can't even validate the map is right or wrong. When they use that data, they figure out problems with that data. They start cleaning that data. They start finding gaps in that data. And I think that's really because people who don't understand that domain, who don't understand violence or public health or poverty or development, they're not going to look at some data and say, oh, this doesn't look clean. Because they don't know the ground truth. They've never been there, right? So if we're putting this data out, we have to give people kind of challenge problems. And when they start solving those problems, they realize in order to predict something about this area, well, it seems like 80% of the municipalities' data is about, they're missing population. Right. And if I only had that, without that I can't predict it, but if I had that, so then you go to somebody and say, hey, can you fill that data? So I really think that cycle is critical, and right now, you know, data.gov needs to be supplemented by problems.gov, right? And so then you connect the two.
And if I may, so that we have more questions, we're each going to answer one question. So very good. So next question, right here, ma'am.
Hi. You know, to your point, I think it's a data disparity, and I think one of the hardest issues is sort of chicken and egg thing, right? We all want to solve the big societal issues, but it's a data set, and the availability requires a panel of experts to collaborate together to come up with that data. And data availability is actually one of the biggest challenges. I mean, it's great that Los Angeles mayor just opened the whole data set. Mm-hmm. But for the data scientists to understand which set of data to get in order to get some kind of intelligence to create an index that actually can pinpoint what the problem is to allocate budgets to so you can actually solve the issue is where I see the biggest challenges are. And with all the predictive analytics and intelligence tools out there, I have yet to see a really actual intelligent tool. And so with the experts on the panel, I would love to hear some feedback on that and what's your approach. Of the two of you,
who would like to take this one?
So I guess I strongly agree with you. You know, my favorite movie is Minority Report. You know what I'm saying? I've been saying, and I was a NASA Goddard CIO for about 3 years when I got there. And one of the things that I would say is, I always go back and visit that movie, because if you look at how many things now are sort of on the brink of becoming real, it is amazing. And you're absolutely right. This whole issue of intelligence is where we haven't really, I think, been able to span over the chasm, because, like you said, there's a lot of data out there. You can even draw some conclusions about it, but is it really intelligent, and does it draw you to the right decision? So, you know, because I'm all about operations and how do we make the right decisions that save life and property. Those are the kind of decisions that we make. And so if I don't do that well, catastrophic things can happen. Right, and so this whole intelligence piece, embedding it, I don't see a tool out there yet as well that we can count on. But that's sort of my view of the future of where we're headed. And now the question is, how do we leverage the crowd? Because I think it's going to come from the crowd. I don't think it's going to come from. It may not even come from the data science community. It may come from another offshoot, another discipline that then, along with the data scientists, along with the computer scientists, so on and so forth, they come up with the answer. But I think we've got to really leverage the power of the crowd to really get to this whole notion of how do we get to intelligence around the data, and then actually that tool.
Thank you. I remember another movie, which is, I'm going to paraphrase, there is no data for the human spirit. Very much so. Next question. Yes, ma'am? Oh, there, okay, there, sorry. I take my orders from there, so.
Sorry for the intercept. My name is Al Ansari. I currently work in the Obama administration's last DoD policy, and one of my projects was the disaster technology portfolio. My question has to do with the big limits and the big opportunity in the word prediction for conflict. And so just to kind of flesh it out a little bit, even in the social sciences, the concept of prediction is kind of on the retreat with like the growth of natural experiments, much to the embarrassment of other social scientists who aren't natural experimentalists. Prediction is not just about big, but it's about complex things that are multivariate, that are not linear. It's not just it's about finding new relationships between data, and unlike conflict, unlike other cases, they're usually one-off cases, very unique, without variables that you can iterate on, in which a pure empiricist strategy falls short. And so my question is what do you think, given all the breakthroughs that will happen in NLP, natural language processing algorithms, what are the big limits of predictive data in conflicts, but also what are the big opportunities?
Thank you. And if I could just preface this one, if you could address this, I was in Switzerland, I think, last year, and someone mentioned when it comes to predicting, we all do great at predicting trends. The problem is inflection points. That's something that a lot of us at the lab are talking about. Like, we want to make a difference. We know a situation can be problematic. Egypt, 30 years under Mubarak, but what was that element at that time? So if you could wrap that up a bit in that context.
Nice.
Yes, you're the last one. Yeah.
What a question.
But you're the economist with me here. You should be able to.
What a wonderful question, though. And I don't think I'm going to have a satisfactory answer. I'm going to ask my colleagues to perhaps weigh in as well, and anyone else in the room. We can crowdsource the answer to this one. I guess I'm both optimistic and pessimistic with respect to the future of predictive analytics. I work across the kind of violent crime, the conflict, and a little bit of the natural disaster kind of space. And each of those present very complex, in some cases even wicked problems in terms of understanding the sort of interactive effects of various variables, whether it's geographic or demographic or climatic or socioeconomic. And so it's one thing to be able to look at one single variable and look at the potential statistical relationship between that and a particular event or outcome. It's quite another when you start aggregating them all together and trying to make some sense of that. Now, when it comes to organized crime, interpersonal crime, I think that's where there's been a huge advancement in the last decade or so around looking at space, demography, time, and a layer of social economic correlates. And there, some police departments around the United States and elsewhere are using certain kinds of predictive, policing type tools, and are able to, I think, anticipate with a fairly high level of accuracy, 80, 90% upwards, where the likely area of certain kinds of crime are going to follow. And that's because, crime, in cities often has certain contagious properties that are slightly predictive. We know that at certain times of the night, you're more likely to see certain kind of crime. We know that if you're close to a place that vends alcohol, it's more likely the risk is going to go up. If you've got a certain number of young people who are exposed, in low-income areas, we know that also. So, in a way, it's sort of not rocket science, but it's this idea of hot spots, hot people, and hot times, to coin a phrase. When it comes to, and that's at a very granular level, and you can kind of raise it up almost to a metropolitan scale, and it's become very influential, certainly in the Americas, and I think increasingly now in Europe and parts of South Africa. When it comes to predicting conflict, there I think we're in a whole other terrain, because it's so highly specific in many cases. And then this question of the inflection point, is also hyper-specific around triggers. Who would have known that a self-immolation, in Tunisia would have led to sort of the kind of neighborhood effects that ultimately emerged? So I don't have a good answer to that. The groups that I work with that are looking and measuring conflict trends, and these are public source groups, use incident-based. They're in the prehistoric era right now, right? They're basically counting numbers on the basis of media reports and then sticking them all together and coming up with estimates. So I feel like that's a whole area where we need to develop. And I think the crowd sort of sourcing idea, the idea that the crowd somehow we can distill indicators from that, I think is a very powerful one, and I think has been tested in places like Kenya and elsewhere with hopefully some positive effect. On the climate change, there I was at a meeting with NASA and Carnegie Mellon just a couple of weeks ago at Davos, and was watching how they come up with their models, and that's a whole other area. So I don't have a very satisfactory answer, except to say that I'm not pessimistic across the board. I see some real, and so maybe the conflict folks can learn a little bit from the crime folks. This is about my point about the schisms and disciplines. Maybe there's a lot of power, because think about it. For police, doing crime investigations used to be about gut. It used to be about, I know this neighborhood, I know those boys, and I'm going to... And now there's a radical transformation taking place in the policing sector where data is driving a lot of the decisions and shaping efficiency and effectiveness of interventions. And I think there's something powerful there that I think maybe, you know, that we can learn from that could be applied.
I think we are heading towards the last question. Exactly, we have the last one that is the... And a couple more, okay, wonderful. So we'll have a couple more, then we'll have a question from the social media.
I have a question.
Thank you.
I'm wondering what's your thoughts about, as we're moving into the Internet of Things and everything is becoming connected to the Internet, including devices, appliances, policemen now with cameras on, online, we're basically getting real-time data and also structured data from all these sensors that we have all over our cities. So I'm just, I feel like we're in the early stages, just like when, I remember back in the PC revolution with the young kids trying to create like little computers to do things, simple things and what have you, and look where we are 20, 30 years later. I feel like we're the merger of technology and peace building and data analytics. We're still in that early stage. But I think like structured data going to become more abundant as with the Internet of Things and smart cities become more and more prevalent. What do you think, so?
Who would like to take this one?
You go and then I'll go. Go ahead.
I love that question, but I don't think I'm allowed to speak anymore.
No. It's all right.
Well, I agree with you fundamentally that I think we're at the very beginning of this. And I think a lot of us in sort of the conflict, peace, security worlds are just now starting to come to terms with it. And we're speaking with people like data scientists and others to understand how to harness it. And the idea that, when I think back to working in South Sudan and doing verbal autopsy surveys where we'd have to basically take everything in, diesel generator together with all our enumerators, with bicycles, with, paper, pencil, we'd have to, and we'd have to, it would take us weeks and weeks and weeks. Everyone would get like some kind of fever and we'd all be shuttled out. Now, literally, you can do phone interviews by automized, because most people now have access to mobile phones. So it's the scale and speed at which you could, and the facility and the cost have all come down or up, and depending on which adjective I'm using. So to me, it's precipitating a revolution. It goes to our colleague in the social, impact investor, in the social sciences, that's allowing access to gain and knowledge, understanding, using a combination of direct and remote tools in ways that we never imagined possible, and we're only now just learning how to do it. On the body camera question and just the issue of wearables, it just so happens that we're also designing an open source body camera right now that we're testing in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo and Johannesburg and Cape Town. And what's fascinating about that is that we now have a couple hundred officers, we'll have about 1,000 in Cape Town this year, using these tools, and essentially the idea is to drive down violence and the excessive use of force by police. You could imagine peacekeepers using this kind of tool. You could imagine others using this kind of tool as a means of equalizing, reducing force, but also as a training tool and other things. But most importantly, what it does is it allows you to map out where are the police at any given moment. This is the first time you can actually understand where is your entire police force distributed. Now, if you can overlay that in real time, and also cumulatively, you can have it for 100 days, 300 days, depending on how much server space you have. What's interesting is that you can overlay that with crime data. You can overlay other forms of data, and you can start understanding, are the police located in those areas that are ostensibly hotspots? The possibilities from an analytical perspective, from a performance perspective, from a training perspective, are kind of infinite. There are also a bit of minority report scariness about that. And so the issues of privacy and civil liberties loom very large in a lot of these new tools, which allow us to have greater understanding and greater granularity of where people are, what they're doing in close to, if not real time. So I think you're right that we are at the cusp of a kind of revolution in this field. I think PeaceTech's job is to sort of hasten or urge that along and incubate it with ethical standards and high principles. But I think that there are incredible opportunities that are already in play in sort of the crime and prevention, violence prevention space that could be, I think, applied in the peace and disaster relief space.
Thank you.
I'd be a little careful before we assume predictive policing works. Right now, we know it doesn't work, right? There's a lot of controversy. Hotspotting, again, prediction is wonderful, the action you take after that prediction is much more important. So hotspotting, we can predict things, but predictive policing hasn't been shown to be successful. It hasn't been shown to reduce crime.
Hotspot policing has been. I mean,
hotspotting is easy because that's prediction. Predictive policing is different, right? Because here's the problem. Sensors are data that we're getting is coming from sensors. It's not ground truth. The crime data we talk about overlaying, it's very biased crime data. It's reported crime data. It's investigated crime data. Take dash cams. So take Chicago right now. Right? They found that 80% of the dash cams in police cars had their sound turned off, and some large percentage had their video turned off. But just because you have body cams and dash cams, the data you're getting from that is extremely biased, because what if people turn it on? What if they have their GPS turned off? So you might think you know where police is. You might think there's crime. I'm not saying we don't use that data, but I think we have to be very careful about training people in how to use, just because, again, there's a lot of it doesn't mean it's good data. And I think it's extremely important to train people how to use that data correctly, make the right inferences, and have policies around it that make sure that we do the right thing. Because it could be dangerous. You don't want data geeks running the world. As much as I'd like to see that happen, you don't want that exclusively to be the state of the world.
Thank you very much. As a last question, we'll do a question from the social media. Oh, we still have time? Fantastic. Actually, I have a question that I'd like, since we're wrapping up. This is an audience of folks interested in peace building, and we've been talking about technology. We use a lot of terms that, even if we're trying, some of these terms are I'm not a data person originally. I actually grew up not thinking I hated numbers because I'm dyslexic. And believe me, it impacts the numbers as well. But something happened at one point, and I said, I'm going to go and I'm going to do it. And I really fell in love with it. And now people think I'm the biggest geek when I get, giddy about numbers. But sometimes it's scary. So folks here are being asked, look at PeaceTech, look at technology. What would be the one advice you would each have, like in one sentence or two, for someone in that situation?
I think the only thing I would say is, I try to stay relevant. And I try not to, it's changing so rapidly. I think you have to constantly just immerse yourself in some of the technology. So I think almost this whole notion of a lifelong learner has to be applied in this discipline, because it's changing so rapidly. You must immerse yourself in it. I mean, I can't, as a CIO, it's a thing that I love, but I have to sort of now push it off to somebody else who is my chief data officer, right? And he comes in and kind of now gives me the slant on it. But and there are so many things coming to the marketplace, open source. All of that is just, it's just inundating, I think, our ability to really think about how we sort of work that. But I think mentally you have to be open to experimentation. You have to be open to being able to actually just gut it through and say, hey, it didn't work, and what did I learn from that? I think organizationally we have to be comfortable with that, because we can't, we may make a small investment or a large investment, and it may result in nothing. And we may, but actually that failure may be something that we can apply in a way that now somebody else taking on that same issue can apply it, and potentially they'll make a slight twist to it, and it will become successful. So I think we've got to be careful in the way that we actually respond to failure and success.
I think I'd say find a friendly, helpful, trusted partner, because a lot of your organization you're working with, you won't be able in the near term to have that capacity in-house, because it's changing so fast. There aren't that many people. So this is a selfish reason to tell you that as well, because universities are a really good partner in that, because they're trying to train their students into doing exactly the right thing. They're trying to create the next generation of you guys. So for example, one thing we started at the University of Chicago is a program joint between computer science and public policy. It's called Computation Analysis and Public Policy, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to train public policy people who are more tech savvy. Another program that I run is called Data Science for Social Good. And what that does, it brings people from around the country, mostly grad students, to Chicago, and we create projects, data-intensive projects with governments and nonprofits, and they spend 3 months working on those. And apart from training students, that also ends up training the governments and the nonprofits we work with. So a shameless plug, if any of you have a project, we have funding to do that work over the summer. So if you have data and a project and could use help from 3 to 4 data science people over the summer, I'm willing to put a project up, and fund that. So
I'm sorry, already taken.
I would simply say this, I would also extend that. I would say if it's possible, build in the capability. If you have any capability of bringing in some of these folks into your organization, they're expensive, they're hard to work with sometimes, but they're really worth it. And that for us was a revolution.
Are we taking the social media question or no? Well, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the audience as always, and truly, and we are getting back to you on that offer. Thank you so much.